Imagine you are standing at the edge of a trail in the Santa Lucia Mountains of California's Central Coast. And then you feel it and not hear it, not see it, feel it, the weight of something watching you. You look up, and there on the ridge above, standing perfectly motionless against the last light of the day, is a figure. It is tall, extraordinarily tall, dark in a way that seems to absorb the remaining light rather than reflect it. Wide brimmed hat, long coat or cloak, completely still, and it is looking directly at you. You freeze, your heart rate doubles in a single beat. You look down for just a moment, maybe 3 seconds, maybe five. When you look back up, the ridge is empty. No movement, no retreating shape, no sound of footsteps or scrambling over rock, just gone. This is not a story invented for this channel. It is not folklore dressed up as news. The account I just described matches almost word for word dozens of independent testimonies collected across more than 300 years of recorded history in this specific stretch of California wilderness. They are called the Dark Watchers, and tonight we go in. Welcome to Kitsune Files. This is the place where we follow the evidence without flinching, where we take the testimony of real witnesses seriously, and where we ask the questions that most people are too comfortable to ask out loud. Tonight's investigation is one I have wanted to do for a long time, because the Dark Watchers of California's Santa Lucia Mountains are not a modern internet legend. They are not something invented by a podcast or a paranormal streaming show. They are older than the state of California itself. They are older than the word California, and they are still being seen today. Chapter 1: The Mountain That Watches Back. To understand the Dark Watchers, you first have to understand the land that made them. The Santa Lucia Mountains run approximately 105 miles along the California coastline, from the upper edge of Monterey County in the north down through San Luis Obispo County in the south. They are not the most famous mountains in California. They are not the tallest, but geologically, atmospherically, and in terms of sheer human strangeness per square mile, they may be the most unusual mountain range in the American West. These are steep, hard, folded mountains. They rise sharply from the Pacific, sometimes gaining 4,000 feet within just a few miles of the waterline. The terrain is violent in the way old terrain gets, compressed and twisted, full of narrow canyons, knife-edge ridges, and dense chaparral that makes off-trail travel feel like fighting the land itself. The weather is unpredictable in ways that catch experienced hikers off guard. Marine fog rolls in from the ocean with almost no warning. In the morning and at dusk, the angle of the Pacific light off those sea-facing slopes creates a quality of illumination that experienced outdoors people describe as genuinely disorienting. Shapes at distance are hard to resolve. The horizon shifts. Things that are not moving appear to move. Things that are moving appear to stand still. This is important context. This is the stage on which everything else happens. Cone Peak, one of the highest points in the range, sits at approximately 5,055 feet above sea level, and it is only 3 miles from the ocean. That is one of the steepest coastal gradients in the continental United States. The ecological transition from sea level Pacific shoreline to alpine ridgeline happens so fast here that the landscape seems almost compressed, almost unnatural. Los Padres National Forest covers most of the interior. Big Sur sits along the northern stretch of coast. The communities nearest to the most active sighting areas are Cambria, Carmel, and the small settlements scattered along Highway 1. This is not a busy wilderness. The ranches are enormous and sparsely staffed. The trails are often empty. You can hike for an entire day without encountering another human being. And for thousands of years, people have been looking up at these ridgelines and seeing something they could not explain. Chapter 2, The Old Ones, Before the Spanish, Before the Word. The oldest human record connected to this phenomenon does not come from European settlers, it comes from the Chumash people. The Chumash have inhabited the central coast of California for at least 13,000 years. They are one of the most sophisticated pre colonial cultures in North America. Their maritime skills, their trade networks, their cave art, which includes some of the most elaborate and technically accomplished rock paintings found anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, all point to a society of considerable complexity and depth. Their relationship with the Santa Lucia Mountains was not casual. The high places were ceremonial ground, they were thresholds. The Chumash worldview recognized the landscape as inhabited by spiritual entities, beings tied to specific geographic features, to water sources, to peaks, to passes. While researchers note that no surviving Chumash text specifically uses the phrase dark watchers, the concept of tall, watchful entities in the high places appears across multiple layers of their oral tradition. The Chumash referred in some accounts to beings they called the Old Ones, entities that were present in the mountains before human civilization arrived and that would remain after it was gone. Thomas Blackburn's landmark compilation of Chumash oral literature titled December's Child represents one of the most complete written records of these traditions. Researchers who have studied it note that while there is no direct equivalent to the Dark Watchers named as such, the conceptual framework, beings occupying the high country, observing neither fully human nor natural animal, is woven through the tradition. What we can say with confidence is this: when Spanish missionaries and settlers arrived in the 1700s, the indigenous people of the Central Coast immediately recognized what the newcomers were reporting. The warning they gave was consistent and clear. Do not go to certain ridgelines alone after dark. Do not approach the figures. Do not try to speak to them or draw their attention. That warning was not invented for the Spanish. It was already there. Chapter 3, Los Vigilantes Oscuros, the name that crossed cultures. The Spanish gave them a name, Los Vigilantes Oscuros, the Dark Watchers. In the 1700s, as Spanish missionaries established their chain of coastal missions and settlers began moving into the interior of the Central Coast, the figures began appearing in Spanish accounts. Journals and land records from this period contain references to dark silhouettes on the mountain ridges, tall, still, unresponsive to approach. The Spanish accounts describe the figures in language that will sound immediately familiar to anyone who has read a modern sighting report. Extremely tall, dark colored, wearing what appeared to be wide brimmed hats and long cloaks, standing on the high points, watching those below, vanishing without apparent movement when approached. The Spanish did not dismiss these accounts. The name they gave them, Los Vigilantes Oscuros, suggests a seriousness of treatment. These were not ghosts in the casual sense. They were watchers, observers, something with purpose. As Mexican ranchers and vaqueros took over the land grants in the post mission era of the early 1800s, the tradition continued. Vaqueros riding the ridges above their cattle ranges reported the figures with such regularity that the sightings became simply part of the working knowledge of the land. You knew about Los Vigilantes Oscuros the way you knew about the weather patterns, not because it was supernatural, but because it was simply true of this particular place. American settlers moving in during the mid 1800s inherited this tradition through the ranching culture. By the time the 20th century arrived, the Dark Watchers were deeply embedded in the living oral history of the Central Coast. They were not legend in the sense of something ancient and forgotten, they were present tense knowledge. And then two of the most significant American writers of the 20th century put them on the page. Chapter 4, The Steinbeck Secret, When Literature Becomes Evidence. In 1938, John Steinbeck published The Long Valley, a collection of short stories set in the landscapes of Central California that he knew intimately from childhood. One story in that collection is titled Flight. It follows a young Mexican American man named Pepe Torres who has killed someone and is forced to flee into the Santa Lucia Mountains. As his mother bids him farewell, she gives him a warning that Steinbeck renders in exact and significant language. She tells him, "When thou comest to the high mountains, if thou seest any of the dark watching men, go not near to them, nor try to speak to them." Later in the story, as Pepe makes his desperate way through the Santa Lucias, Steinbeck writes, Pepe looked up to the top of the next dry, withered ridge. He saw a dark form against the sky, a man's figure standing on top of a rock, and he glanced away quickly, not to appear curious. These are not the words of a man inventing a legend for dramatic effect. They are the words of a writer including something he grew up knowing as real. Steinbeck wrote about the Santa Lucias the way he wrote about the Salinas Valley and Cannery Row, with the precision of someone reporting on the world he actually knew, and the origin of his knowledge was specific. His mother, Olive Hamilton Steinbeck. Olive Hamilton was a school teacher who grew up in the region and rode regularly through the remote sections of the Santa Lucia Range to reach her students. According to Thomas Steinbeck, John's son, his grandmother saw the Dark Watchers on multiple occasions during those mountain rides. But Olive Hamilton did not simply observe them and ride on, she interacted with them. According to Thomas Steinbeck's documented account, his grandmother developed a practice of leaving offerings in a shaded alcove near Mule Deer Canyon. She left fruit, walnuts, and flowers, and when she returned on subsequent rides, she found that the offerings had been replaced. In their place were feathers, seashells, and pine nuts. Thomas Steinbeck described his grandmother as a no-nonsense Scotch-Irish woman with a spine of steel. She was not a superstitious or easily frightened person. She was a working school teacher riding alone through remote mountain territory, and she treated the Dark Watchers with the practical respect of someone who had decided, these things are real, I am going to be respectful of them, and I am going to carry on with my day. The exchange of offerings is one of the most remarkable elements of the entire Dark Watchers record because it implies something that most paranormal accounts never reach, a kind of reciprocity, an acknowledgement from both sides. If accurate, it suggests that whatever is in those mountains is not simply a passive optical phenomenon. It is aware, it responds, it communicates in its own minimal way. Now let us talk about the second major literary figure connected to the Dark Watchers, Robinson Jeffers. Jeffers was a poet of enormous stature who lived at Carmel by the Sea at the northern edge of the Santa Lucia Range for most of his adult life. He built his famous Tor house with his own hands on a cliff above the Pacific. He spent decades walking the mountains and headlands of the Central Coast and writing about what he called the inhumanist beauty of the natural world. In his 1937 poetry collection, Such Counsels You Gave to Me and Other Poems, Jeffers wrote these words about the figures on the ridgelines. He described them as forms that look human to human eyes, but certainly are not human. They come from behind ridges to watch. Forms that look human to human eyes, but certainly are not human. Jeffers was not a credulous man. He wrote about the natural world with a cold and unsentimental eye, and he wrote those words without qualification or hesitation, as though describing something as established as the fog or the granite. Two of the most serious literary minds to emerge from California in the 20th century. The same mountains, the same phenomenon, neither treating it as legend or myth, both treating it as a documented fact of the landscape they knew. This is where the story gets more specific. Chapter 5, The Witnesses, Real People, Real Encounters, No Excuses. Every account I am about to describe comes from a documented source, a named witness, a published account, a recorded interview, or a verifiable newspaper or book archive. I am not inventing composite characters. I am going to tell you exactly where each account comes from. The first account is from Thomas Steinbeck himself. Thomas, John Steinbeck's son, was born in 1944 and grew up with direct family connections to the Big Sur region. In the accounts he gave before his death in August of 2016, Thomas described a personal sighting of the Dark Watchers during his childhood in the Big Sur area. He and a companion were hiking when they saw a figure standing completely still in a manner that immediately registered as wrong. Not wrong in an obvious theatrical way, wrong in the specific, quiet way that something registers as not behaving the way it should. The figure stood where the terrain made standing extremely uncomfortable for a normal person. It was too still, and when they looked directly at it, it was gone before they could fully process what they were seeing. Thomas spent the rest of his life taking the Dark Watchers seriously. His 2014 book, In Search of the Dark Watchers, co created with California landscape painter Benjamin Brode, represents a sustained, documented attempt to understand the phenomenon. In that book, Thomas drew on his grandmother's accounts, his own childhood experience, and the testimony of local figures who had lived in the Big Sur area for generations. One of those figures was Billy Post. Billy Post was a descendant of the El Sur Grande ranching family, one of the oldest and most established ranching operations in the Big Sur region. He was, at the time Thomas interviewed him, the resident sage of the Post Ranch Inn, which is named after his family. Billy Post was a man whose family had worked that specific land for generations, who had spent his entire life in the shadow of the Santa Lucias. Thomas Steinbeck described Billy Post as one of the authenticating sources for the Dark Watchers tradition, a man whose family had passed down knowledge of these entities through generations of practical ranching life. This is not folklore in the academic sense. This is working knowledge, the kind of thing you tell your children not because it makes a good story, but because it might keep them safe. Now let us move to the 1960s. According to newspaper archives from the mid 1960s, a man described as a Monterey Peninsula local and a former high school principal went on a hiking trip in the Santa Lucias. The principal was not a man given to fantasy. He was an educator, a community figure, the kind of person whose account carries a certain institutional weight precisely because of who he was and how he was known in that community. During that hike, he spotted a dark figure standing on a rock and surveying the surrounding area. He called out to his fellow hikers to look, and by the time they turned, the figure had vanished. This was not a lone hiker in a vulnerable psychological state. This was a group outing led by a prominent local figure in ordinary hiking conditions. The figure was there long enough to be clearly described. It was gone before anyone else could confirm it. The account was documented in contemporary local newspapers. It is not an anecdote passed down through memory. It is a period contemporary news record. Now let us come to the modern documented accounts, the ones with named witnesses and specific locations on the record. In 2013, a woman named Elizabeth Benitez from San Mateo, California, was driving back from Los Angeles with a friend. They were passing the San Luis Obispo Reservoir when Elizabeth saw something she could not explain. She described what she saw in these terms. She said she saw something at a distance at the end of the mountain. It was a really big human figure, but it wasn't. It had a black cape, kind of like the Grim Reaper, and it was leaning over, holding onto a staff at what looked like a puddle of water at the base. It was daytime, so she could clearly identify that it was not a person. Even in mid light, it was very black and reminded her of a raven. She told her friend who was driving to look at the mountains. Her friend looked. Her friend immediately described, without prompting, exactly what Elizabeth had already seen. Elizabeth said she asked her friend what she saw without giving her own details first. Her friend described exactly what Elizabeth had seen. Her friend only looked for about 5 seconds, and she almost lost control of the car when she looked away. The figure affected her that strongly. Two witnesses in a moving vehicle, daytime sighting, a second witness independently confirming the first witness's description without being told what to look for first. That is one of the cleaner corroborated sightings in the modern record. Also in 2013, a witness known publicly as Brian from Hollister, California, reported seeing a figure while driving home along a road he traveled every single day. Brian's account contains a detail that is hard to dismiss. He said they were coming home toward the San Juan Bautista and Hollister side when they saw a very large dark figure standing at the edge of the mountains. He said this was extremely strange because he had never seen anyone cross over the barbed wire fence at that location, and he traveled that road daily at all hours. He and his companions drove past the figure slowly. He described watching it staring off into the distant valleys and mountains toward Fremont Peak. He described it as having a large cape with straight, very broad shoulders. He noted it seemed to have a hunch or prominence on its back. Think about what makes that account compelling. It is not the description of the figure itself, it is the context. A man who drives that road every single day, who knows exactly what is normal at every point along that road, who immediately identified that something was standing in a location where crossing the fence would have been both obvious and unusual. He did not need to invoke the paranormal to know that something was wrong. He knew it was wrong because he knew that road. That is a different quality of witness than someone encountering the unfamiliar for the first time. Another account involves a woman who visited Big Sur as a guest of her former husband and his new wife, who were locals. She had no prior knowledge of the Dark Watchers. She was a visitor seeing the mountains for the first time. While sightseeing, she looked up at the peaks and asked about what she assumed were thin statues on the summits. She described them as too still and too defined to be natural formations. Her companion's reaction stopped her cold. They looked genuinely frightened, and they told her those were not statues. They were the Dark Watchers. They explained that the local Native American tribes had known about them since the beginning of time. The visitor saw something. She assumed there was a mundane explanation because she had no framework for anything else. When she described what she saw, the people who had grown up near those mountains responded with fear. She was not primed. She was not told what to look for. She looked at a mountain she had never seen before and saw figures she initially tried to rationalize as sculptures, and the locals recognized immediately what she had seen. Now, I want to tell you about Benjamin Brode, the painter who collaborated with Thomas Steinbeck. Brode traveled to the Big Sur wilderness specifically to paint and experience the landscape associated with the Dark Watchers. He was a rational man, an artist. His primary interest was the aesthetic and atmospheric qualities of the place. He hiked into the hills above the new Camaldoli Hermitage near Lucia. He carried offerings, following the tradition that Olive Hamilton Steinbeck had practiced as a form of respectful acknowledgement. And on one of those days, while sitting quietly in the forested hills making color sketches, Benjamin Brode heard voices. Not wind through trees, not animals or birds, voices. He described them as sounding clearly like two women in conversation, recognizable as human speech, close enough to suggest the speakers were very nearby. He was completely alone on that hillside. He investigated every natural explanation: wind through rubbing tree trunks, the acoustics of the canyon below him, the sound of the creek. None of them fit. He was hearing human voices in a place where no humans were. A skeptical artist on a painting trip encountered something he could not account for in the same hills where the figures have been reported for centuries. Chapter 6: The Science Strikes Out. Why every rational explanation falls apart. Now let us examine what science offers as an explanation, because intellectual honesty demands this step. The most widely cited scientific explanation for the Dark Watchers is the Brocken specter. A Brocken specter, named after the Brocken Peak in Germany's Harz Mountains, is an optical illusion that occurs when the sun is positioned low behind a hiker and a fog bank sits below and in front of them. The sun projects the hiker's shadow forward onto the cloud surface, magnified enormously. The result is a towering, elongated silhouette that appears to stand at a distance. The Brocken specter is real. It has been photographed. In the right conditions, it can produce a tall, dark, cloaked looking silhouette. Here are the problems with that explanation for the Dark Watchers specifically. First, Brocken specters almost always appear with a circular rainbow halo around them, called a glory. This effect is distinctive and unmistakable. It does not appear in a single Dark Watchers account in the entire documented record, not one. Second, Brocken specters require strong sunlight behind the observer. The majority of Dark Watcher sightings occur at dusk and dawn, when the light is weak, diffused, and angled at exactly the wrong orientation for specter production. Third, and most critically, a Brocken specter is the observer's own shadow. It mirrors every movement the observer makes. It cannot stand still while the observer moves. Multiple documented witnesses describe approaching the figures and the figures remaining completely stationary before vanishing. A Brocken specter is physically incapable of that behavior. Fourth, Elizabeth Benitez and Brian from Hollister were in moving vehicles at low elevation. The Brocken specter requires the observer to be at elevation above a cloud layer. Neither witness was anywhere near those conditions. The Brocken specter probably explains a small percentage of sightings under very specific conditions. It does not explain the documented record as a whole. Pareidolia is the next explanation: the brain's tendency to find human and animal forms in random visual data. We see faces in clouds, we find figures in rock formations. In the Santa Lucias, with their vertical rock formations and strange light and dense chaparral, pareidolia is a real and serious factor. A tall rock shadow at dusk could become a figure in a coat and hat to a tired, anxious brain, but pareidolia cannot account for the disappearance. Rock formations do not vanish between glances, and pareidolia produces vague impressions. It does not reliably produce the precise, consistent, cross-cultural description of a tall entity in a wide-brimmed hat holding a walking stick, maintained identically across 3 centuries of independent witnesses. That is not what pareidolia looks like. The third explanation is infrasound, sound below the human hearing threshold of 20 hertz. Wind through mountainous terrain can generate infrasound at frequencies proven to cause anxiety, dread, the sense of a presence, and mild visual disturbances. A landmark British study by psychologist Christopher French in 2008 placed volunteers in a room rigged with infrasonic generators. Most participants reported the feeling of a presence. Some reported terror. The researchers were surprised by the intensity of the responses. This is genuinely compelling for the emotional component of the experience. The dread, the irrational urge to leave, the feeling of being watched before anything is seen. But infrasound produces feeling, not visual content. It does not reliably generate the specific, consistent description of a hat and cloak and staff across independent witnesses who have never spoken to each other. A fifth explanation comes from neurologist Michael Persinger, whose research into temporal lobe sensitivity found that mild electromagnetic stimulation of the brain's temporal lobes reliably produces the sense of a nearby presence, and the Santa Lucia Mountains sit on a geologically complex fault zone where piezoelectric effects from rock stress can generate low-level electromagnetic fields. This might explain the feeling of being observed. It does not explain the visual specificity. When temporal lobe events produce visions, those visions are personal and idiosyncratic. They reflect the individual's own internal symbolism. They are not consistent across thousands of witnesses across 3 centuries. So we have 5 serious scientific explanations. Each accounts for something, none accounts for everything. And taken together, they still leave the most important questions unanswered. Why here specifically? Why this consistent description? Why the mutual awareness? And why are people still coming down from those mountains with the same story after 300 years? Chapter 7: What Science Cannot Touch, the Theories That Go Deeper. Now we go beyond the conventional framework. The first and in many ways most grounded theory is the oldest one, that the Dark Watchers are exactly what the indigenous peoples of the Central Coast always described: non-human entities bound to the land of the Santa Lucia Mountains. This is not a naive position. It is the most persistent interpretation in the historical record. It predates every other explanation by thousands of years. The Chumash recognized the land as inhabited by beings that existed before human arrival and would persist after human civilization was gone. The concept of the Old Ones fits the Dark Watcher's profile almost exactly: ancient, local, observing, not communicating in human terms, maintaining a separation from human life while remaining present within the same landscape. What gives this theory particular weight is the exchange of offerings. Olive Hamilton left fruit and walnuts and flowers in a specific location. Something left feathers and seashells and pine nuts in return. If accurate, this implies physical presence. Whatever the Dark Watchers are, they can handle objects. They can make choices about what to leave in an exchange. This is not a ghost. This is not a vision. This is something with hands. The second theory involves what researchers call liminal entities, beings that exist at the threshold between what we consider normal physical reality and something adjacent to it. Certain places on Earth show consistently higher densities of anomalous reports across multiple categories simultaneously. Not just one type of strange event, but several, occurring over extended time periods in the same geographic area. The Santa Lucia Range fits this pattern. The liminal entity theory proposes that these locations are places where the boundary between ordinary observable reality and something else becomes thinner or more permeable. The Dark Watchers exist primarily in that adjacent space, but become briefly visible to human observers where the separation weakens, particularly at dusk and dawn, when the physical world itself is in a state of transition. This explains the disappearance, not movement across terrain, transition back across the threshold. Consider what this reframing means. If the Dark Watchers exist in a layer of reality normally invisible to us, then the reason they are only seen in the Santa Lucias is not that they are only present there. It is that the Santa Lucias are one of the places where the membrane between their reality and ours is thin enough for human perception to reach them. And the reason they are seen at dusk and dawn is not their behavioral preference. It is that our own perceptual system is most open to them during transitional light. The limitation may be on our side, not theirs. The third theory takes the mutual awareness detail seriously as a standalone phenomenon. Multiple independent witnesses with no apparent connection to each other have described the same experience, looking up at a dark watcher and realizing the figure was already oriented toward them at the precise moment they first became aware of it. Not that it turned when it noticed them, it was already turned, as though it knew a moment before they did that they were about to look up. In ordinary sensory perception, awareness is sequential. You see something, then it reacts to being seen. The response comes after the perception, not simultaneously with it. What witnesses are describing is different. An entity that was already observing them specifically before they were aware enough of it to be a target of its attention. If this is real and the consistency of the independent report suggests it is, then the Dark Watchers perceive something before the event that makes them visible. They know they are about to be seen before they are seen. This implies a form of awareness that is not bounded by the ordinary forward flow of time. It is the most philosophically uncomfortable detail in the entire record, and no natural explanation has ever addressed it. The fourth theory is territorial intelligence, geographic binding. Whatever the Dark Watchers are, they are not reported in the Sierra Nevada, not in the Cascades, not in the Rockies, not on the Pacific coast. Generally, they are here in the Santa Lucia Mountains, specifically and consistently. This geographic specificity is one of the most powerful pieces of evidence the phenomenon is real and local rather than a general property of human perception in mountain environments. Optical illusions do not respect mountain range boundaries. Pareidolia is universal. Infrasound is generated by wind in mountain terrain worldwide. But the Dark Watchers are Santa Lucia entities. It is worth noting the Santa Lucia phenomenon has global structural analogs. The Amphir Leith Moor, the big grey man of Ben Macdui in Scotland, is associated specifically with one peak. Serious mountaineers with no interest in the paranormal have reported it with complete conviction. The Almas of Central Asia, the Yeti of the Himalayas in its original cultural context before it became a brand. What distinguishes the Dark Watchers in this global context is behavioral uniqueness. Most mountain entity traditions involve aggression, pursuit, or intimidation. The Dark Watchers, almost uniquely across all comparable traditions worldwide, simply watch. They observe, they do not pursue, they do not threaten unless their territory is violated. Whatever they are, their behavioral profile is unusual even within the broader global pattern of mountain entity traditions. The fifth theory involves the accumulated weight of 13,000 years of human attention. The Chumash looked at those ridgelines every day for thousands of generations. The Spanish settlers looked at them with documented fear. The ranchers looked at them. The modern hikers look at them. What if that sustained, multi-generational, cross-cultural focusing of human attention on the same specific ridgelines has done something? Not through any intentional ritual, simply through the sheer force of sustained belief and expectation maintained across thousands of years, pointing at the same peaks. The concept that concentrated collective belief can, over sufficient time, generate something with observable presence and behavior in the physical world appears across multiple philosophical and esoteric traditions. The Santa Lucia Mountains represent exactly the kind of sustained human focus that, if this theory has any validity at all, would be expected to produce a result. A sixth theory addresses something most coverage ignores entirely: the selective visibility pattern. Multiple witnesses and the folk tradition consistently note that the Dark Watchers appear preferentially to travelers with simple equipment: walking sticks, hats, basic gear. They reportedly do not reveal themselves to those carrying high tech cameras and recording equipment. If accurate, this is deeply strange. It implies the Dark Watchers make choices about whether to be perceived. It implies intentionality and intelligence operating at a level that places them far beyond any natural phenomenon. One interpretation connects this to the mutual awareness theory. If the Dark Watchers can perceive something about an approaching observer before that observer is aware of them, they may also perceive something about the observer's relationship to the landscape. A person moving through the mountains with simple tools in the old way may register differently to whatever perceptual system the Dark Watchers use than a person carrying cameras and devices. The old travelers were part of the landscape. The Dark Watchers may be responding to that difference. Chapter 8: The Pattern Nobody is Talking About. Before we move to the final dimension of this investigation, I want to step back and look at the complete pattern, because pattern recognition is how you solve a case, not individual details in isolation, the shape of everything together. The Dark Watchers are reported overwhelmingly at dusk and dawn, not at noon, not in the middle of the night, at the edges of the day. This temporal pattern is too consistent across too many independent witnesses and too many time periods to be coincidental. Whatever the Dark Watchers are, there is something about the liminal light of dusk and dawn that makes them perceptible to human eyes in a way that midday does not. The figures are almost always described at height, on ridgelines, on the summits of rocky outcrops, on the peaks of passes, not in valleys, not in forests, on the high points where sky meets land, consistent across the entire record. The stillness is absolute and universal in every account, not just very still, completely still, in a way that witnesses describe as wrong, as inhuman, as the specific quality that first alerts them this is not a person. A human being standing on a rocky ridge at dusk moves. They shift their weight, they turn their head, they fidget. Whatever the Dark Watchers are, they do not do any of these things. The disappearance is instantaneous and universal. No account in the documented record describes a Dark Watcher walking away. No account describes one retreating into vegetation. They are there, then they are not there, and the transition between those two states happens faster than human attention can track. These disappearances happen at different speeds in different accounts, but none of them involve locomotion across terrain. The figure is present, then the figure is absent, and the space between those two states is not traversal, it is cessation. The animal behavior pattern is one of the most understudied aspects of the entire record. Multiple ranching era accounts describe horses becoming agitated or refusing to continue toward certain ridgelines, dogs barking toward high ground and then retreating, cattle avoiding specific slopes. Animals do not respond to optical illusions. They do not respond to Brocken specters or infrasound induced human anxiety. Animals respond to electromagnetic fields, to certain sound frequencies, and to the presence of other biological entities. If the animal behavior pattern is real, it suggests the Dark Watchers have a physical signature that extends beyond the merely visual, something the animals can detect that most humans cannot. And then there is the no evidence paradox. In the entire documented record, no physical evidence of the Dark Watchers has been recovered. No tracks, no disturbed vegetation, no biological material, no photographs that have passed scrutiny, nothing. This is consistent with two interpretations that are diametrically opposed. Either nothing is there and the witnesses are reporting perceptual experiences generated by their own nervous systems in response to environmental factors, or something is there that does not interact with the physical world in a way that leaves ordinary evidence. Both interpretations are consistent with the no evidence observation alone. You need the full pattern to distinguish between them. And when you look at the full pattern, the second interpretation holds together much better than the first. The number of independent witnesses, the cross cultural consistency, the specific visual description maintained across 300 years, the geographic specificity, the animal reactions, the exchange of offerings, the mutual simultaneous awareness. These things together do not describe a perceptual artifact generated by the human nervous system. They describe something with presence, intelligence, awareness, and purpose. What that something is remains the open question. And the honest answer is that we do not know. Chapter 9: The Warning That Never Changed and What Happens When You Ignore It. There is one more dimension of this investigation I need to address directly. The tradition around the Dark Watchers is not merely descriptive, it is prescriptive. It comes with rules. Every cultural layer of the Dark Watchers record, Chumash, Spanish, Mexican ranching, American ranching, modern, includes some version of the same behavioral guidance. Do not approach them. Do not try to speak to them. Do not try to photograph them. And do not stare, look away quickly, and carry on. This is not casual advice. It is the kind of warning that gets passed down through generations because it has been tested and found to matter. The warning existed in the Chumash tradition before any Spanish settler arrived to hear it. It was present in the Spanish accounts. It survived into the ranching era. It is in Steinbeck's fiction, In the Mouth of a Mother to Her Fleeing Son. The specific consequences attached to violating this guidance are stark. Those who approach the Dark Watchers are said to vanish. Some researchers have connected this to the missing 411 cases documented by David Paulides, which catalog unusual disappearances in national parks and wilderness areas across North America. Some of these cases occur in the broader geographic area associated with the Santa Lucia Range and the central coast of California. I want to be precise about what I am and am not saying here. I am not asserting that the Dark Watchers cause disappearances. The causal connection has not been established. The Santa Lucia Range is genuinely dangerous wilderness terrain, and people go missing in dangerous wilderness for entirely tragic and mundane reasons. What I am noting is that the folk warning predates the research by centuries. Whatever the original basis for that warning, it was considered important enough to survive every cultural transition this landscape has witnessed across 300 years of documented history and possibly much longer. Olive Hamilton Steinbeck understood the rules intuitively. She did not approach. She left offerings at a designated location in a designated way and moved on, and something responded by leaving gifts in return. Her practice was one of respectful, non intrusive acknowledgement from a safe distance. That is perhaps the most practically useful information in this entire investigation. The approach that appears to have worked, documented in the Steinbeck family record, is not investigation or pursuit. It is acknowledgement and respect from a distance. Whatever the Dark Watchers are, that is apparently acceptable to them. Chapter 10: What 300 Years of Evidence Actually Tells Us. Let us now consider the full picture. 300 years of documented reports with oral tradition extending at least several thousand years further. Reports from indigenous observers, Spanish settlers, Mexican ranchers, American ranching families, a former high school principal documented in newspaper archives, a Nobel laureate's mother who left offerings and received gifts in return, a Nobel laureate's son who saw them as a child and wrote a book about them as an adult, two of the most significant literary figures in 20th century American writing, both treating the phenomenon as documented fact, a California landscape painter who heard voices in an empty hillside, a woman who almost lost control of her car, a daily commuter who identified immediately that something was wrong because he knew that road. And beneath all of these 13,000 years of Chumash presence in this landscape, looking up at those ridgelines with the full weight of a sophisticated culture's understanding that the mountains are not empty. When you sit with this record, really sit with it without the instinct to find a comfortable exit ramp toward a conventional explanation. What you find is not ambiguity. What you find is the outline of something real, something that has been present in the Santa Lucia Mountains for longer than recorded history reaches, something that maintained a relationship with Olive Hamilton Steinbeck that involved the exchange of gifts over a period of years, something that Thomas Steinbeck saw as a child and never forgot, something that Billy Post's family knew about across generations of ranching in its territory, something that a high school principal saw on a rock above him in the 1960s and called to his companions to witness, and that was gone before they could turn, something that Elizabeth Benitez and her friend both saw from a moving car in broad daylight in 2013, each describing the same thing without the other's prompting. Something that Brian from Hollister saw standing in a location he passed every day, standing in a way that was immediately and unmistakably wrong to someone who knew that road. Something that turned toward its observer at the exact moment of being observed, before the observation was complete, as though the act of looking and the act of being seen were not two separate events, but one. The physical description across all of these accounts is consistent in a way that defies coincidence. Tall, between 7 and 15 feet, dark in a way that absorbs rather than reflects light, wide brimmed hat, long flowing coat or cloak, sometimes a staff or walking stick, completely unnaturally still, oriented toward the observer, present at dusk and dawn, gone without transition when approached. The geographic concentration is absolute. The Santa Lucia Mountains, specifically and consistently. The behavioral pattern is consistent across the entire record. They watch, they do not threaten unless their territory is violated. They do not communicate in any human language. They vanish before contact can be made, and they appear to already know they are about to be seen before the observer looks up. No currently available scientific framework accounts for all of these properties simultaneously. What we are left with is something that has been present in these mountains for as long as human memory reaches in this place, something that observes human activity from the high ground, something that interacts with the material world in at least one documented way, something that knows when it is about to be observed, and something that has inspired the same behavioral warning across every cultural group that has ever lived near it. That is not nothing. That is a phenomenon. Chapter 11. The only approach that ever worked. There is a tendency in modern paranormal investigation to treat every unexplained phenomenon as a problem to be solved, a puzzle with a correct answer waiting to be unlocked. We bring cameras and electromagnetic field detectors and night vision equipment and competing theories, and we stand in the landscape and demand that it explain itself to us. The Dark Watcher's record read carefully suggests that this approach may be exactly wrong for this particular phenomenon. The people who have had the most consistent and meaningful interactions with whatever is in the Santa Lucias are not the people who pushed. They are the people who acknowledged and kept moving. Olive Hamilton Steinbeck, who left gifts and received gifts in return, who traveled those mountains for years and was never harmed. The vaqueros who understood that certain ridge lines were to be acknowledged and given their distance. The Chumash, who lived in that landscape for 13,000 years in what appears to have been a state of functional coexistence with whatever shares it with them. The mountain does not owe us an explanation. The Dark Watchers have never claimed to. What if the appropriate relationship with the unexplained is not investigation but acknowledgement? Not pursuit but respect? What if the reason the Dark Watchers have appeared to humans across thousands of years without ever being captured, photographed, or measured is not that they are too clever for our tools, but that they are simply not participating in that game? They are not hiding from us. They are standing on the ridge lines in plain sight at dusk, visible to anyone who looks up at the right moment. They are just not interested in being studied. And maybe in the end, that is the most human thing about them, the desire to be seen without being dissected, to exist in their own landscape on their own terms, observed by the humans passing through below, observing in return and leaving it at that. Chapter 12, still dark, already looking. The Santa Lucia Mountains are there right now. As you listen to this, somewhere along that 105-mile spine of coastal California, the light is failing. The fog is moving in off the Pacific. The chaparral is silver in the dark. The ridgelines are empty of everything visible to the human eye at this distance and in this light, or they appear to be. Billy Post's family ranched those mountains for generations and passed the knowledge down. They did not write books about it. They did not file reports. They simply told their children, there are things on the ridgelines, you know what they look like, give them their distance. Olive Hamilton Steinbeck rode those trails alone with fruit and walnuts and flowers in her saddlebag, left them at the alcove near Mule Deer Canyon, and came back on her next ride to find feathers and seashells and pine nuts in their place. She did this without drama, because it was the right thing to do in that landscape. Thomas Steinbeck saw one as a boy, carried that experience for the rest of his life, and spent some of his last years trying to document what he and his family had known. Robinson Jeffers looked at those same ridgelines from his stone house above the Pacific and wrote that whatever stands on them is not human, though it looks human to human eyes. John Steinbeck put a mother's warning into the mouth of a fictional character, and that warning has been read by millions of people who had no idea it was drawn from real family knowledge about real entities and real mountains. And somewhere in a 2013 news archive, Elizabeth Benitez is still saying, I know what I saw. My friend saw it too, and it was not a person, and it was not nothing. We do not know what the Dark Watchers are. We know that they are seen. We know where they are seen and when. We know how they are described across 3 centuries and multiple cultures and multiple independent witnesses with no connection to each other. We know they do not harm in most accounts. We know they watch. We know when they are about to be watched. We know they leave no physical evidence except for feathers and seashells and pine nuts in a shaded alcove near Mule Deer Canyon. The oldest warning attached to them has never changed. Do not approach them. Do not try to speak to them. Look away quickly and carry on. And the Santa Lucia Mountains are there right now. And at the turning of the light tonight, something may be standing on that ridgeline still, dark, patient, already looking toward you. The ones who followed that warning, the ones who looked away quickly and carried on, they came back to tell the story. The next time you are in a wild place at the edge of the day, the next time the light is failing and the ridgeline above you is going dark and the air carries that particular quality of stillness that feels less like absence and more like attention. Look up, not to search, not to photograph, not to prove anything, and just to look. And if something is standing there still and dark and patient against the last light, look away quickly and carry on. That is what the record recommends. That is what has worked across every culture and every generation that has moved through the Santa Lucia Mountains for the past 13,000 years. The Dark Watchers do not need us to believe in them. They have been standing on those ridge lines since before any of us were born. They will be standing there after every camera and microphone and recording device we have ever built has turned to dust. They simply watch. And now you know what they look like, and now you know what to do. This has been Kitsune Files.